Mayday, mayday! Engine failure at 15,000 feet. Captain Sarah Mitchell's voice stayed calm as her F-16 started falling toward the desert below. In the control tower, the male pilots who had been betting against her survival suddenly went silent. They were about to witness why the Pentagon had classified her previous missions for 15 years. What happened next didn't just save her life. It revealed that sometimes the most dangerous missions are flown by pilots whose records are too classified to brag about, and the woman they wanted to fail was about to show them skills that don't exist in any flight manual. Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada had been home to the most elite fighter pilots in the world for over 7 decades. The desert facility, known as the home of the fighter pilot, was where America's best and brightest came to prove themselves in the unforgiving skies above the Mojave Desert. The morning sun cast long shadows across the flight line as ground crews prepared F-16 Fighting Falcons for another day of intensive training. Captain Sarah Mitchell walked across the scorching tarmac toward her assigned aircraft, her flight suit crisp despite the 105-degree heat that was typical for July in Nevada. At 32, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen combat, but her presence at Nellis was anything but welcome among her fellow pilots. The 414th Fighter Squadron had been an all-male unit for its entire 40-year history, and most of its members intended to keep it that way. As Sarah approached her F-16, she could hear the conversations that weren't meant for her ears, but weren't exactly whispered either. "Can't believe they're forcing this diversity experiment on us," muttered Lieutenant Jake Morrison, a hotshot pilot from Texas who had graduated top of his class from the Air Force Academy. "This isn't a place for social experiments." "Give her a week," added Captain Mike Rodriguez, adjusting his helmet bag. "One rough flight and she'll be crying to transfer back to transport duty." Staff Sergeant Tommy Walsh, the crew chief responsible for Sarah's aircraft, shook his head as he watched the men talk. He'd been maintaining F-16s for 15 years and had seen plenty of pilots come and go. "You boys might want to check her file before you start making bets," he said quietly. "What file?" Jake laughed. "Her record is thinner than a sheet of paper. Probably flew cargo runs and called it combat experience." What none of them knew was that Sarah's file was thin because most of it was classified at levels they didn't have clearance to access. The Pentagon had redacted 12 years of missions that officially never happened, operations that would remain buried in black folders for decades to come. Sarah performed her pre-flight inspection with methodical precision, her hands moving over every surface of the aircraft with an expertise that spoke of countless hours in similar cockpits. She checked the engine intakes, examined the control surfaces, and tested the weapon systems with the efficiency of someone who understood that attention to detail was the difference between coming home and becoming a statistic. As she climbed into the cockpit, she could see the other pilots gathered around the flight planning room, their body language making it clear they were discussing her. Through the glass, she watched Jake make an exaggerated gesture of a plane spinning out of control, followed by laughter from the group. The morning briefing had been professional, but cold. Colonel James Harrison, the squadron commander, had made it clear that Sarah was here on orders from higher command, not because he wanted her. The mission was standard air-to-air combat training over the Nevada Test and Training Range, with Sarah flying as number 4 in a formation of experienced pilots. "Mitchell," Colonel Harrison had said, his tone carrying the weight of someone who had already made up his mind, "you'll be flying with Morrison's flight. Try to keep up." The implied message was clear. Don't embarrass yourself, and don't get in the way of the real pilots. Now, strapped into her F-16 at 15,000 feet over the vast Nevada desert, Sarah was about to prove that some lessons can only be learned the hard way. The formation had been airborne for 23 minutes when Sarah's engine began showing irregular reading. At first, it was subtle, a slight fluctuation in the exhaust gas temperature, a minor variance in fuel flow. But Sarah's trained eye caught the anomalies immediately. "Lead 4, I'm showing some irregular engine parameters," she reported calmly over the radio. Jake Morrison's voice crackled back with barely concealed irritation. "Copy 4, probably just your imagination. Continue with the exercise." But Sarah knew better. She had felt this exact combination of symptoms before, in a different desert, during a mission that didn't exist in any official record. The memory was crystal clear. The same engine fluctuations, the same gradual loss of power, the same inevitable conclusion. "Lead 4, I need to return to base immediately. Engine failure imminent." This time, Jake's response was openly mocking. "Come on, Mitchell. We're 10 minutes into the exercise and you're already looking for an excuse to quit." "Negative 4. came Colonel Harrison's voice from the lead aircraft. "Stay in formation. Complete the mission." That's when Sarah's engine exploded. The F-16 shuddered violently as metal fragments tore through the engine bay. Warning lights illuminated the cockpit like a deadly Christmas tree, and the smell of smoke began seeping through the environmental system. At 15,000 feet, with no engine and limited gliding capability, most pilots would have immediately ejected. "Mayday! Mayday! Engine failure at 15,000 feet!" Sarah's voice remained steady despite the fact that her aircraft was now a $30 million glider with very limited options. In the control tower at Nellis, the atmosphere changed instantly. The casual conversations stopped, coffee cups were set down with trembling hands, and every eye focused on the radar screen, showing Sarah's aircraft beginning its uncontrolled descent. Lieutenant Morrison's voice came over the radio, the cockiness replaced by genuine concern. "4, eject! Eject now!" But Sarah was already running calculations in her head: wind speed, altitude, distance to the nearest suitable landing area, glide ratio, and a dozen other variables that most pilots would never consider in an emergency. What she saw in her mind wasn't the Nevada desert below, but the mountains of Afghanistan, where she had once performed a similar miracle that saved not just her own life, but the lives of 8 Special Forces operators who had been depending on her for extraction. "Negative on ejection," Sarah replied calmly. "I'm taking her home." The control tower erupted in protests. "Mitchell, that's impossible. Dead stick landing in an F-16 has never been successfully attempted." What they didn't know was that it had been attempted and successfully completed by Captain Sarah Mitchell over the Hindu Kush Mountains in 2018, during an operation so classified that even its existence was denied by the Pentagon. As Sarah began her descent, muscle memory took over. Her hands moved across the cockpit controls with practiced precision, configuring the aircraft for the most efficient glide possible. She lowered the landing gear to increase drag and improve glide characteristics, a counterintuitive move that most pilots would never consider. "Tower, I need emergency vehicles standing by. I'm coming in on runway 03 left." "Mitchell, you're 8 miles out with no engine. It's not physically possible." But Sarah had already calculated the glide path. In her mind, she could see every foot of the approach, every variable that would affect her descent. The skills weren't theoretical. They had been tested in combat, refined under fire, and proven when failure meant not just her death, but the failure of a mission that had taken months to plan. As the F-16 descended through 5,000 feet, Sarah made minute adjustments to her flight path, using her knowledge of desert thermals and wind patterns to extend her glide. In the tower, veteran controllers who had seen thousands of landings watched in amazement as the powerless aircraft maintained a perfect approach angle. "She's actually going to make it," whispered the tower chief, a man who had been working at Nellis for 25 years. At 1,000 feet, Sarah deployed her drag chute early, trading airspeed for a steeper descent angle that would put her exactly where she needed to be. The F-16 touched down on the runway centerline at 180 knots, rolled for nearly 2 miles, and came to a stop just 500 feet from the end of the runway. Emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft within seconds, but Sarah was already shutting down systems and preparing for egress. When she climbed out of the cockpit, she was met by a crowd that included every pilot from her squadron, ground crew members who had stopped their work to watch, and Colonel Harrison himself. The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds before Jake Morrison stepped forward. His face was pale, and his voice carried none of its earlier arrogance. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "how did you know to do that?" Sarah removed her helmet and looked at the assembled group. For a moment, she considered giving them the standard answer: training, instinct, luck. But these men had just witnessed something that required an explanation. "Because I've done it before," she said simply. Colonel Harrison stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "Mitchell, your file shows transport and training assignments. When could you have possibly—" "Sir," Sarah interrupted gently, "my file shows what the Pentagon wants it to show. Some missions don't make it into the official record." That evening, Colonel Harrison made a phone call to a number he wasn't supposed to have, to a person whose name he wasn't supposed to know. The conversation was brief, but when it ended, he sat staring at his desk for nearly an hour. The next morning, Sarah found a new flight assignment on her desk. Not a punishment or a transfer, but lead pilot for the squadron's most challenging training missions. Attached was a note from Colonel Harrison. "Some lessons can only be learned from someone who's already survived them." Jake Morrison approached her during the pre-flight briefing, his demeanor completely changed. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology, and if you're willing to teach, I'd like to learn how to be half the pilot you are." Sarah looked at the young man who had been so eager to see her fail. "The most important thing I can teach you, Lieutenant, is that being a pilot isn't about proving you're better than someone else. It's about making sure everyone comes home." Over the following weeks, the squadron's attitude towards Sarah underwent a complete transformation. The men who had dismissed her as a diversity hire began seeking her advice on advanced flight techniques. The pilots who had made jokes about women in fighter jets found themselves learning maneuvers from someone whose experience surpassed their own. Sarah never spoke about the classified missions that had prepared her for that day over Nevada. She didn't need to. The proof of her capabilities had been written in the sky during 8 minutes of perfect flying that turned a catastrophic engine failure into a textbook landing. 6 months later, when Lieutenant Morrison successfully completed his own emergency landing after a bird strike damaged his engine, he credited the techniques Sarah had taught him with saving his life. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the squadron. The woman they hadn't wanted had become the instructor they couldn't do without. Colonel Harrison, who had initially opposed Sarah's assignment to the squadron, wrote in her efficiency report, "Captain Mitchell represents the finest traditions of Air Force aviation. Her technical skills, combat experience, and leadership abilities make her an invaluable asset to any unit fortunate enough to have her." But perhaps the most telling change came during a squadron social event 6 months after Sarah's emergency landing. As the pilots shared stories and celebrated another successful training cycle, Jake Morrison raised his beer and offered a toast. "To Captain Mitchell," he said, his voice carrying the respect of someone who had learned an important lesson. "The pilot who taught us that skill isn't determined by gender, and heroes don't always look like what we expect." The response was unanimous. "Here, here." Sarah smiled and raised her own glass. "To good flying and safe landings," she replied, "and to remembering that we're all on the same team." As the evening continued, Sarah found herself surrounded by pilots eager to hear more about advanced emergency procedures, high-altitude flying techniques, and the mental preparation required for combat missions. The woman who had once been seen as an unwelcome outsider had become the heart of a squadron that was stronger, more capable, and more unified than ever before. But late that night, as Sarah reviewed the day's flight reports, she allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Not because she had proven herself to the men who had doubted her, but because she had found a way to pass on knowledge that might someday save lives. The classified missions would remain classified. The operations that had forged her skills would never appear in any official history. But in a squadron of fighter pilots who now understood that excellence has no gender, her legacy would continue every time one of them faced an emergency with the confidence that comes from learning from the best. Sometimes the most important victories are the ones that don't make the headlines. Sometimes the greatest teachers are the ones whose credentials can't be displayed on the wall. And sometimes the people others don't want turn out to be exactly the people everyone needs. Captain Sarah Mitchell had proven all of these truths in 8 minutes of perfect flying over the Nevada desert. And in doing so, she had changed not just her own career, but the lives and perspectives of every pilot who had witnessed her grace under pressure. The woman they didn't want had become the pilot they couldn't imagine flying without.